Hi everyone, thanks for joining. I'm just going to wait minutes to let some more families join and then we'll get started with the training. Alrighty, well, welcome everyone. My name is Coach Sonia. If I haven't met you yet, thank you for joining this evening. I will be talking about BSMD programs, the reason that you've joined today to get some answers on your pre-med journey, and all about BSMD programs versus the traditional path. So let's get started. What we'll cover today briefly, we'll do a quick introduction to me, why I'm qualified to be giving this presentation today, what BSMD and BAMD programs are, where to find them, and what makes a competitive applicant, some strategies that I would recommend that I've seen work before, some timelines, interviews, and some reflections on my own experience, as well as a question and answer session for you guys to be able to ask me questions. So just a little bit about myself, why I'm here today. I am Coach Sonia. I'm a fourth year medical student. I'm currently in the process of applying for residency. I, in the past, have scored in the 99th percentile on the SAT, ACT, and the MCAT, which is the introductory exam, or I wouldn't say introductory, which is like the board exam that you take prior to applying to medical school, similar to how you take the SATs prior to applying to college. And I've also taken step 1 and step 2, which are the two licensing exams to become a doctor. And I was originally in a BSMD pathway, which is the pathway that I used to enter medical school. And I started using my experiences through the pathway to begin coaching students with BSMD applications 5 years ago. And since then, I've helped with college coaching, high school classes, high school advising, pre-med advising, and mentoring, as well as tutoring for several board exams and school subjects as well. So my story is that I grew up in New Jersey and I knew I wanted to be a physician since I was a young child. And that's kind of why the BSMD pathway was the right pathway for me. So I applied to 18 BSMD programs and 5 non-BSMD universities, meaning non-combined programs. Out of those 18 programs, I interviewed for 9 of those programs and was ultimately accepted to 2 of them. The program that I chose was an 8-year BSMD program, which allowed for a 6-month co-op period. And a co-op period is 6 months of time where you're not taking classes and you're actually working full time. So during that time, I was doing clinical research at Penn Medicine, working on sleep medicine and geriatrics. And I think that was a really fantastic experience to have as a undergraduate student because usually research comprises of wet lab and not much patient interaction, but through the co-op, I was able to get some patient interaction as well. And then I graduated a bit early and had some time to travel as well, which I think was really crucial for helping me grow as a person. And now here I am, 8 years after graduating high school. I am finishing up my last year of medical school and applying to residency. And residency is where after you graduate med school, you're essentially training in the specialty you want to specialize in. So you're doctor in training. So because I knew I wanted to be in medicine my entire life, that's kind of why I felt a BSMD program was right for me. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I will talk more about the programs in the next few slides. So kind of getting into what are BSMD or BAMD programs. So think of these programs as a medical school acceptance delivered early, but with some fine print. And the structure and the competitiveness of these programs may vary, and tonight we'll talk about how to approach them in a smart and tactful manner. So the BSMD program or BAMD comprises of the undergraduate plus the graduate degree. So the BS or BA is your bachelor's degree in science or arts, is what BS or BA stands for, and then medical doctorate is the MD portion, and that's your postgrad degree. So the programs range from 6 to 8 years total. Um, 8 years means you're doing 4 and 4. 7 year means 3 years in undergrad, 4 years in med school, and then 6 would mean 2 years of undergrad and 4 years of med school. The med school portion is never abbreviated, it's always 4 years. The part that would be shortened if you're in an accelerated program is the undergraduate part. And this is the conditional acceptance to medical school. What that means is, yes, you're admitted to the med school, but that's conditional on a few different requirements, and the programs vary in those requirements. So just for example, most programs have an MCAT requirement, and like I mentioned, the MCAT is like the SATs for med school. I like to say it's the SAT on steroids. It's a lot tougher, long exam, and you usually take months to prepare for it. And then later on, you take step 1, step 2, which are even tougher, but let's not get there right now. So the MCAT is what you take your last year of undergrad before you go to med school. It's not something you take in high school. I see a question coming about whether you take the MCAT in high school. The MCAT is what you take in college. So when I say requirement, it's after you're accepted into this program. When you're an undergrad, to keep that med school spot, you still have to kind of do these things to have that spot waiting for you, even though you were accepted. So in addition to the MCAT, they also have a GPA requirement. For my program, it was greater than a 3.6, and some programs also have research or volunteering requirements. And the MCAT requirement is usually reaching the average MCAT score for that med school's acceptance. And they often give you multiple tries to reach that score. So for example, my program gave you 3 tries to get the MCAT score. And the RGPA requirement was 3.6, and we also had a volunteering requirement. And in addition to the BS or BAMD program, I should talk about what is the alternative way to go to medical school. So this is just one pathway to enter med school. It means you're getting that acceptance early when you're in high school. The traditional pathway actually means that it's a 4+4. So you're finishing your undergraduate 4 years. And in the same way that you apply to college at the end of high school, you're applying to med school at the end of undergrad. So you'll be writing a personal statement, you'll be working on applications, and you'll be interviewing after undergrad. And that's actually the more common way to go about. BSMD programs are very competitive and very rare, and we'll talk about why they're beneficial. But the alternative way is to do the traditional path where you do your 4 years of undergrad and then you apply to medical school afterwards. And that means you can even take a year or two in between undergrad and medical school. In terms of where to find a list of programs, there's various lists online, and I do realize that you're not able to click on these URLs through this virtual webinar, but I would recommend either screenshotting or noting down just like the URL. So you could search the Perfect Med BSMD list, My App Architect BSMD list on Google, and the list will come up. I do recommend checking out various lists because they often highlight different things. For example, I know these last two on my slide include some things about acceptance rates, what the average SAT scores are when they're accepting students, as well as the requirements. So I think when you're looking into programs, don't just rely on big name schools. There are some excellent programs at lesser known universities that often fly under the radar, but they have amazing opportunities. And by looking through these lists, you can kind of start to differentiate the programs. So like I mentioned, I think that these BSMD programs are fantastic, but they're not for everyone. So there's definitely a few things to keep in mind about the benefits of these programs and some things to keep in mind to see if it's a right fit for you. So whether you're in an accelerated program, meaning a 6 or 7 year, or a guaranteed assurance program or a conditional acceptance program like a 8 year program that I was in, I think they have several advantages. So the first one being if you're in an accelerated program, you are saving 1 to 2 years off of school, and college is expensive. So saving some years off of school means saving some tuition. In addition, I already mentioned with the traditional pathway, you're going through that entire process of applying to schools, working on your personal statement, and your application and interviews all over again, essentially at the end of your 4 years. Whereas if you're doing this entire process now and having that early acceptance, it's a little bit less stress later on. So you're not having to go through that entire process. And I think the biggest thing with these programs is that they're not just saving you time and money, but they're also giving you freedom. With fewer barriers between undergrad and med school, you can really focus on learning and exploring and doing things outside of medicine that are of your interest. So there's a lot more time for personal pursuits in college. And just for example, because I was in a BSMD program, I feel like I had a lot more time where I was actually able to join a dance team in college and I traveled quite a bit. And both of those were really great to help me build a support system, make some friends, and also learn more about myself. What are my likes, my dislikes, what are my values and my um, things that I prioritize. And that's helpful in helping me grow and being the best physician that I can be for my future patients. Another really great thing about these programs is you essentially have a blueprint of where you're going to be for the next 6 to 8 years. And that means you know where you're going to be for medical school. So you can start to reach out to physicians, doctors at that med school and get some early clinical exposure, whether that be through research or shadowing. Oftentimes, med schools are really receptive to students of their own school. So if they know you're going to be a future student there, they are more likely to be receptive to hearing from you and helping you out with getting clinical exposure. Some of the programs, they do not require the MCAT, so those programs are nice because you can avoid taking the very dreaded exam. And the last thing I think that I wanted to touch on this slide is community with your cohort. With these programs, there's usually between 10 to 25 students that kind of follow along the program with you. My program started off with 20 students, and at the end, there were 17 who matriculated to the medical school. And you're able to build connections, make some friends, find community in your cohort. And medical school is a really tough time, so having peers that you can rely on and trust is really important. One of my friends that I met through my cohort, we traveled together for a few months through Southeast Asia together, backpacked, and we ended up rooming together for first 2 years of med school. And she's one of my best friends. And I'm really grateful to have that continued support and that friendship throughout our 8 years that we were able to develop because of the program. So, like I mentioned, there's definitely a lot of benefits with these programs, but there are some things to consider. You are signing a legal contract for the next 6 to 8 years, which means that if you're not 100% sure that you want to go into medicine, these programs might not be the best fit for you. I wanted to go into medicine as far back as I can remember, and that's why I felt like having this blueprint of the next almost 10 years set for me was a really good idea. Once you're in the program, you're largely locked into one institution for 6 to 8 years. It's often hard to pivot, and there are oftentimes some restrictions on what you can major in. So, for example, my program only allowed you to major in biology, chemistry, psychology, biomedical engineering, and I believe biochemistry. So if you were interested in something like the arts or business, you're not able to major in that. That doesn't mean that you can't take classes in those subjects. I was able to minor in Spanish and public health, and I took plenty of classes that didn't span any of those fields. So I took classes in wine tasting and cooking and culinary arts. So across really random specialties, my major was limited. So if you're somebody who wants to major in something in the business field or in the arts or something else, maybe a BSMD program is not right for you just because of that limited flexibility in major. And that being said, when you're applying the traditional pathway, the beauty of being pre-med is that you can really just major in anything you want. That doesn't mean you have to major in bio. If you're pre-med, a pre-med advisor at your university will help you in ensuring that you're taking those pre-med classes like honors chemistry, AP chemistry, biochem, etc., but you don't have to major in something specific like that. And then with the accelerated programs, they often do compress college into 2 or 3 years, which means you have less time for exploration, for study abroad, for doing research, or just being a college student. And now that I'm here, about to graduate med school, I realize how important that time is in your late teens and your early 20s when you're out there having fun and just being a student. Those years are so important in helping you grow as a person. I already touched on this earlier, but um, those are really years of your life that you don't get back. And I feel like when we're younger, we're often in such a rush to go to med school. We're in such a rush to become a doctor, but those days will come, and I feel like there's no reason to rush it. So having those 8 years or having those 4 years of undergrad for me, I think was uh, very helpful in helping me become the person that I am today and the way I approach topics and approach subjects. With these programs, I think you have a certain extent of academic pressure, so you must maintain a high GPA. Like I mentioned, my program was a 3.6, and they have MCAT requirements. So the pressure may feel higher than regular pre-med path because you're trying not to lose that guaranteed seat. Regardless, if you're pre-med, you're going to have a level of academic pressure just because you have to be top of your class. You have to be a competitive applicant if you want to go to medical school. But sometimes the fact that you have that guaranteed seat waiting for you might cause a level of increased pressure or burden. Some students also burn out or they coast through undergrad and they feel unprepared for medical school rigor. Medical school is unlike anything else you've ever experienced. People say it's like drinking water through a fire hose, but I think even that figurative statement is um, not doing it justice. It's really difficult, and I think that sometimes students in BSMD programs might feel like, hey, I can just chill out, I can relax, and they haven't really worked hard since high school then. And when they enter med school, that feeling of grinding and putting in that work becomes a forgotten habit. So I think if you're someone who might get complacent, that's something to consider as well. And then others might feel trapped in medicine if their interests shift. So oftentimes through undergrad, you decide, hey, I want to go into research, I want to go into something else within healthcare, whether it's policy, public health, global health, or you want to go into pharmaceuticals, you want to go into being a different level of healthcare provider. If you're in a BSMB program, it may feel as if you're trapped in medicine. And then I already said that you might miss the growth that comes with the traditional process. Traditional applicants, they grow through rejection, through reworking their stories, and some BSMB students may not get that same personal or professional development until later. I do recognize that in my early years of med school, I did feel like I was one of the youngest in my class. Of course, I was still able to make plenty of friends, and I had people who were my age, but I think the average entry age for med students is increasing over the years, and that means that people are taking more gap years, meaning gap years in between undergrad and med school to do other things like research, working, and all those experiences really allow for them to bring interesting perspectives and experiences into patient care. I remember one of my peers, he was a case manager for individuals with disabilities during his gap year. And whenever we had cases we were working through, he had a really interesting perspective that he was able to bring. Whereas for me, all I'd ever really done was go to school and study. Thankfully, I had the co op, which gave me some real world outside experience, but oftentimes if all you've ever done is be in college, it's hard to get that outside perspective. So now let's talk a little bit about the application strategy. I already mentioned that these programs are highly competitive. The acceptance ranges range from about less than 2% to up to maybe 5%. And to really be a competitive applicant, you need to have high GPA and test scores. It's unfortunate that's the way it works, but when schools and programs are getting thousands of applications, they need a way to kind of screen out from those thousands to hundreds to be able to consider, hey, what are the 100 students we're going to be interviewing? And oftentimes, an immediate screening tool is these GPA and test scores. The important thing to keep in mind is that admission committees, they want future doctors, not just top students. So it's really important to show maturity, insight, and real world experience in healthcare. And you're able to do this through clinical exposure, whether that be shadowing or volunteering, um, in some capacity, showing that you've been in the healthcare environment, interacted with healthcare professionals, and you have an understanding of what it really means to be in healthcare. I think even for myself as a middle schooler or high schooler, you often see medicine being portrayed in TV shows and movies as this very idealistic career where you're entering medicine, helping all these people, and everything's really fine and lovely. Which, of course, it's a really wonderful field, very rewarding, but it does involve a lot of hard work, a lot of personal sacrifice in terms of time and finances. And admissions committees want to see that you're recognizing this even though you're 17 or 18. Because anyone who's applying after undergrad in their 20s, they know this. They've seen this. They're still choosing to apply. But in high school, they want to see that you still have that same level of maturity. Just for example, my third year, I was at the hospital by 4 a.m. on my surgery rotation, which means I was waking up around 3 a.m. every day. And then I'd come back by 7 p.m., study for a few hours, and kind of do the same thing every day. Um, and it's not easy. So, but I didn't know that when I entered medicine. I didn't know that it was going to be like that. I don't think that's a forever thing. It's part of training, but just showing that you know that it's going to be tough is really helpful. Research is very impressive to have on your application. It's definitely difficult to get as a high schooler, but if you're able to show that you were actively involved in a project and maybe even on a publication, that's highly impressive. And the biggest thing is having a compelling personal story and showing that maturity. And we'll talk a little bit more about the essays in a few slides, but I think the big thing with the compelling personal story is that you want to make sure that all your experiences that you talk about, like your clinical exposure and your research, they all help to support that reason why you want to pursue medicine. And you're essentially creating a brand for yourself. You're talking about your reason for wanting to do medicine, why that's unique from someone else's reason, and you're talking about why your experiences help support that. So, getting into a quick timeline, your timeline if you're applying to BSMD programs will run earlier than regular college admissions. So, you need to stay organized and start the summer before your senior year. If you're a freshman or a sophomore attending this webinar series, I think it's a good time to really reflect on what are your reasons for wanting to pursue medicine? What are your reasons for wanting to do a BSMD program? And then you can reflect on your experiences and see what are you missing? Do you have leadership? Do you have service? Do you have research? And then if you don't, how can you kind of fill in those gaps by the time you're a senior? If you're in your junior year or going into your senior year, I think spring, summertime is a good time to kind of finalize your list. I already mentioned that there's so many different BSMD programs out there. And if your goal is to go into medicine and if you're really looking for a BSMD program, it's probably in your best interest to apply to multiple programs. Like I mentioned, I applied to 18. Just statistically, it's an increased odds if you're applying to more programs. And then also because they are so competitive, you want to have backup options. So you want to also apply to programs that aren't BSMD programs. And almost all BSMD programs will require you to write extra essays just the beyond your personal statement. So you want to make sure that you're able to work on those essays over the summer as well. And then all BSMD programs, most if not all, are due on November 1st. So you need to have everything ready by then. And then in early winter, like November, December, is usually when you find out if you were accepted into the undergraduate portion of your application. And then if the undergrad accepts you and they like your application, they'll forward your application to the med school. Med school reads through your application, and if they like your application, they'll invite you for an interview. And the interviews take place in usually the late winter, so Jan, Feb. And then in Feb, March is when you really hear back on your offers and your wait lists. So as you can see, it's quite a dragged out process from the fall when you're submitting to not finding out officially until the spring. So it definitely requires a lot of patience. We require to have some backup plans and also requires you to stay organized because there are so many components to the application and requires you to constantly be on top of your email checking. And some of the programs even require you to email them certain documents rather than submit them through the Common App. So you need to really look into the websites of all the programs that you're applying to make sure you're not missing out on some of those deadlines. So now let's talk a little bit about the essays. I think the essay is the most important part of the application. And your BSMD essay is going to be different than your regular college personal statement. You're going to write your personal statement, and those are usually about an experience or an activity or something interesting that's happened. But your BSMD essay should, there might be different prompt, but they're all essentially asking why medicine, why my med school, and why now. So these essays require more maturity because the stakes are higher. It is not a joke to be entering or to be accepted into medical school at 17 or 18. Um, so it's really important to think deep down why. I know if you're part of our coaching program, you've probably heard us say why a million times for everything. But I think if there's any place to apply it the most, it'd be here. Why medicine? And tie it to the actions you've taken, to your experiences, and put those all together to create a brand for yourself. And when you say why now, it means that your reason for wanting to pursue medicine as a 17 or 18-year-old should be as strong as someone who is in their 20s and saying, I want to do medicine. And I think what's really crucial is showing longitudinal interest. And this means that you can show that your activities over a long period of time helped show that transformation in your interest. For example, you can say, hey, when I was in elementary school, I liked science, so I did this. Then in middle school, I explored by joining this club and doing this. Then in college, not college, sorry, in high school, I joined this and I volunteered here and I did this research and my interest grew in this way. So kind of incorporating all your experiences to show how your interest grew. And that's what shows that longitudinal interest. Because if you just mention one experience you had summer after your sophomore year, that shows that you're kind of a flaky person. You had one experience and you're like, oh, I want to do medicine. And they might think, oh, next summer you might have an experience working at a hedge fund and then you want to do business. So it's important to show that commitment because they're committing a spot from their class 4 years from now for you. That's a big deal. And then we already talked about demonstrating an understanding of the career. And I can't reiterate this enough how important the essay is in really showing why the activities you did were important to you. I always tell students that two students can do the exact same thing, but what they took away from that experience and how it made them approach medicine or life can be different. And that's the part that will help you stand out from someone else. So we already talked a bit about the essays. So moving on to the interviews and what to expect for the interviews. I think the interviews can definitely be intimidating for high school students. We're not really used to such formal interviews at this point in your career, probably. Um, but these interviews are quite intense and they're with the medical school admissions committee. So definitely not a joke, very serious, very professional. Need to wear all business professional, of course. And the interview questions can really vary depending on the program. You can get questions as basic or as simple as tell me about yourself. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Asking about academics. Um, the interviews can be in the format where it's you and one other person, you and two other people. And I think many med schools are actually shifting towards the MMI format. MMI is mini multiple interview. And my med school was actually one of the first few to start implementing this. And this is what my med school interview was. It was the MMI style. So what this means is instead of a regular interview where it's you and one or two other people, which leaves quite a bit of room for subjective interpretation and subjective judgment. Like, for example, if they don't like the tie that you're wearing or they don't like one of the statements you made, they may start to unconsciously um, insert a bias into everything else that you're saying. Whereas with the MI, you're in different rooms for short periods of time with different interviewers. So that allows for a more objective view on you and your responses. And the MMI style questions can be really fun because some rooms can be ethics questions about controversial topics like abortion or euthanasia. And this requires you to study beforehand. You need to be prepared to talk about these topics and know what's going on in the medical field and medical ethics. Some of the rooms you enter can be situational. So, for example, they can have a paper outside the door and they give you 30 seconds to read it, where it says, for example, hey, you're a doctor, one of your patients just had a mammogram last week. You've got the report back from the radiologist, patient has stage 4 breast cancer. She's now in your office and you need to break the bad news to her. And then the timer beeps and you have to enter this room, and the interviewer that you're talking to is the patient. So it's role play. And this is a really great way for the school to really judge you and see or assess you and see how is your communication, how is your empathy, your compassion, how are you able to deliver bad news, what do you know about mammograms. So these are fun to be in, but they're also really helpful for the school to judge you. And I was actually involved with the admissions committee in my undergraduate school and my medical school conducting these interviews and reading applications. So I know that the MMI style was fun for both ends, for the interviewers and for the interviewees. There's also instances where they might ask you on interview day, hey, you have 30 minutes, go write an essay about this topic, and you need to be ready to do that. Um, and I think in terms of the interview, one of the big things to make sure you're staying authentic. Some students have a way of writing, and you should make sure that the way you're speaking and behaving is correlating with the way you're writing. If you have a very sarcastic voice through your writing, but when you come in person, you're a very stoic person, they might start to question, hey, who wrote that essay? It's not the same student we're seeing in person. Or if you wrote a very stoic essay without much voice, and then you're a very humorous person again. It just doesn't align. So you want to make sure that your brand and who you are aligns, and you want to make sure you're honest about everything you put in your application, in your essay, because they might pick up on things in your interview and ask you about them, and you need to be prepared. I even heard students, and even I actually got a question that was a little bit silly. I got a question like, if you were a vegetable, what kind of vegetable would you be? Which is very silly, but the point of that question is to see, can the interviewee stop, breathe, smile, and then answer? You know, you have to be able to show that your personality, show your authenticity through these interviews while still maintaining a professional composure. I think the biggest thing with interviews is just practicing as many times as you can. Doing mock interviews really helps with preparing responses. And now, just a few things that I want to touch on are some things that I felt like no one told me when I was going through the process, and some of my students have also shared reflections later on. I think it's important to really acknowledge that these programs are wonderful for all the reasons that I mentioned, but they're not the only path to going into medicine. Whether or not you get in, you're still on the road to becoming a doctor, and this is the less common path going to medical school. The more common path is the traditional way. So if you don't get in, it's not the end of the world. You can still pursue medicine and apply again after undergrad. Something else to keep in mind is some programs actually allow for deferral or a flexible medical school entrance. So what that means is that after your undergraduate years, some schools allow you to take a year or two to, whether it's to travel or to research or to work a job. But those really vary by program. So I think it's so important to do your research on the programs, find out more information about them. And also, when you sign the contract, make sure you know what you're signing and be really diligent in knowing the fine details. With some of the med schools, they allow you to apply to other med schools during your program. So, for example, let's say you're on year 3 or 4 of your program and you decide, hey, I kind of want to go somewhere else for med school. Some programs will allow you to do that. Other programs may have a rule where, as soon as you send an application out to another medical school, you automatically lose your seat in the guaranteed program. which essentially means you're gambling because you're sending an application out somewhere else without the guarantee that you'll get in, and now you're losing your spot in the med school that you had a guaranteed spot in. So that's something to think about. Some programs won't do that, some will. So again, look into the details of the program that you're applying to and that you're accepting. And I think some of the biggest takeaways from today's presentation are that these programs are difficult, but they are achievable. And I'm walking proof of that, and so are many of my students. The biggest things to be successful are to plan as early as freshman year, start working towards getting those uh, leadership experience, volunteering experiences, service opportunities at research, and building your reason for why medicine. Be organized with all your activities, noting down things, your application, and most of all, staying authentic. I think me as an interviewer and being interviewed. I think that staying authentic is so important. People can really tell when you're genuine, when you have passion versus when you're kind of just saying stuff that you've memorized. And I think one of my biggest compliments that I've heard even now as I apply for residency is that people can really see my energy shine through. And I think that's really important in a room where you're interacting with patients. You want to be able to show them you care, show them that you want to be involved in their journey through health. So that authenticity is really important. And your story matters more than your stats. I know that I mentioned these programs are highly competitive. I mentioned some ranges of scores. And at the end of the day, if you're kind of in the range, but you have a really fantastic story, I feel like it's still worth a shot. Your story is really important. If you're really far off from the score ranges, it might not be realistic to apply to a BSMD program. Not saying you can't be a doctor, but just doing it a different route and maybe trying to work on boosting up your grades through an undergrad. Um, but again, the story is the part that separates you from someone else. Two students can get 1550s, can get 4.3 GPAs, but if one student has these really fantastic experiences and able to explain why they were so helpful in their journey, whereas another student just says, "Oh yeah, I did this," the student that can explain things better is obviously going to do better. And lastly, I've heard this growing up from my parents, never believe them, trust the process. Now that I'm almost a year away from graduating medical school, I think that's more true than ever. Everything does work out. It's just very important to take one step at a time. So depending on where you are in high school, where you are in your path, just take the next step and trust that things will work out. I will take a break for a minute or two just to drink some water, and then I see some questions building up in the chat. So I will start answering some of those questions. And anyone else who's on call, feel free to put in more questions into the chat. Happy to talk about anything, to clarify anything, or to talk more about what it's like to be in med school in my journey. Okay, so I see a question come in. Is the BSMD application through the Common App? Yes. So most programs will have their essays and things, the additional requirements through the Common App. So what you do is you add the undergraduate university you're applying to, and then there's usually an option to click that you're applying for a combined degree program or a accelerated graduate program. And then once you select that option, the additional requirements like the essays will drop down. So that's where you see the additional requirements, and that's all through the Common App. So these programs will receive your Common App essay as well as the additional essays that I mentioned, which should be different from your personal statement. And they will see that same activity list on your Common App, but the way you explain your activities through your essays is what will be important. And some schools may require you to email them certain documents or certain essays. So for all the programs you're applying to, stay organized, look at the websites, and write down any requirements that those programs may have in addition to the Common App requirements. I see a question come in. What did you do to get interviews? There's nothing in particular I did. I think it's just that holistic application that I talked about. For me, I think I really tried to center my entire application around one theme and was really able to tie in all my activities and how each one of those experiences helped me support my reason for wanting to do medicine and what kind of doctor I want to be in the future. And then I see a question, how did you prep for interviews? Yeah, that's a really good question. I think you want to be ready for any type of topic. I already talked about some of the different types of questions you may get. You can go online, just search common med school interview questions on Reddit. There's many forums, many websites, and even YouTube videos. And you want to try to go through as many of those questions as you can, get comfortable with talking about yourself, get comfortable with talking out loud. I know that it's a little bit of weird feeling to talk about yourself, especially out loud, but this is your time to shine. You've put in all the hard work. You just have to present it in the best way possible. So you want to practice being concise with your responses and being comfortable answering various questions. And if you can have like a family member, a friend, or a mentor ask you those questions, it helps to do it in another. It helps to do it in front of another person, and it is a little bit different when you're practicing with yourself versus someone else. So having someone else there can be really helpful. I see a question, the time in between receiving an interview and finding out when you have them. Yeah, so it kind of varies per school or per program. They usually give you at least a week or two notice. Based on my experience and the students that I've worked with, some schools may even offer you a few dates and ask you which date works best for you. And it's like a sign up sheet, so you have to be on top of your email checking frequently. Um, but it's usually at least a 2 weeks notice. I wouldn't say it's ever like, hey, come in tomorrow. I see a question about some struggles with getting activities in high school that are healthcare related because of regulations about being under 18. Yeah, I think that's a fair point, and these rules have gotten more strict after COVID, but I think that there still are plenty of opportunities to get involved. Many hospitals do have programs that are geared for students younger than 18, and they often don't involve patient care. They're more so helping out in the hospital and other means, but I think those experiences are still really valuable because you're playing a role in an indirect way in patient care, even if it's not direct. And then also, those are good opportunities for being in the healthcare setting, and maybe you might be in the elevator with a cardiologist and you're interested in cardiology, or you can talk to someone and say, hey, like, where are the cardiologists? Where's their office? And you can go chat with them, talk to them, reach out. Once you're in the environment, it makes it a lot easier to build connections. Those are definitely good ways to get in. Something that I did was a lot of, well, all towns have a first aid and rescue squad, and that's the EMT squad that comes when you call 911. So many of these rescue squads, they have programs for high schoolers where you don't need to have an EMT certification. You can do some CPR training, some BLS training, basically life support training, and you are able to take call with the EMTs. And I remember my shifts were 12 hours from either 5 p.m. to 5 a.m. or 5 a.m. to 5 p.m. And you help with stocking the ambulance, you get to join on the calls, and you're officially helping. And sometimes they let you take vitals as well. And you get to see some really, really fascinating examples of patient care. And a lot of my things that I wrote about in my essays came from my experiences riding on the ambulance and seeing patient care interactions that way. I also worked as a pharmacy technician in a local pharmacy. It wasn't a big brand name like CVS or Walgreens. It was a local pharmacy, which is why they were more inclined to take high school students. But I was able to get some really interesting experiences seeing how the intersection between patients, insurance companies, and pharmacists work. So that was definitely a cool experience to write about. Um, and even if you're doing things that aren't healthcare related, I think you're able to really connect them back to the healthcare setting, and write about them in your essays that way. So one example I always give for students is if you're on a sports team, a team sport. I played lacrosse all through high school. You can talk about healthcare is a team sport. For example, rounding in the ICU, it's not just one attending. We have a attending doctor, we have physical therapists, respiratory therapists, nurses, residents, medical students. Um, it's a whole team of healthcare providers, and everyone brings their own different experiences, their own different specialty. Um, and that's what kind of gets the team together to work towards that common goal. And that's similar to how it is on a sports team when everyone has different positions, different skill sets, and you're working together to reach a common goal as well. So you can use non-medical experiences and just talk about what qualities you learned from them that would help you in a medical setting. And again, that's showing a level of maturity that you're able to apply these skills. If you're able to volunteer in a senior center, you're interacting with the elderly, which do make up a large portion of the patients that you see in healthcare these days. So, talking about compassion, empathy, patience, interacting with the elderly population is really important. You can make those qualities of yourself highlighted through your essays and your activities. So, those are just a few examples. Getting some comments that this has been helpful, so I'm really glad to hear that. I will hang on for a minute or two to see if any more questions come in. It seems like questions are slowing down. I'm glad this was helpful for families. Alrighty, everyone. Well, thank you for joining. I hope you have a great evening, and I'm glad this was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to talk.